The tray rattled as the flight attendant slammed down the juice, her cold eyes cutting into Marcus like a verdict. Passengers glanced over confused why such harshness was aimed at a polite 9-year-old traveling alone. Marcus shrank into his seat, clutching his model airplane, his dream of flying dimming under the weight of humiliation. To Claire Mitchell, he was just another burden, another child to scold. What she didn't know was that Marcus wasn't just any boy, he was the son of the very pilot commanding this flight. Her disdain wasn't crushing a child's spirit, it was setting the stage for her own reckoning at 35,000 feet. In his room that morning, Marcus was surrounded by model airplanes, each carefully arranged, as if about to take off in formation. The walls were a tribute to his love of aviation, posters of every kind of aircraft imaginable, from vintage prop planes to sleek modern jets to Marcus. These weren't just pictures and models. They were part of his world. Today wasn't just any day either. Today was the day he would be flying alone for the first time, headed to see his aunt. But what made this trip even more special was that his dad, Captain Jordan Williams, would be flying the plane himself. Marcus handled his favorite model plane, a miniature version of the aircraft his father flew, turning it carefully over in his hands after checking for any loose parts. He wrapped it in a soft cloth and tucked it into his backpack. "You're coming with me," he whispered to the plane with a grin. The sound of footsteps made Marcus look up, and his face brightened at the sight of his father standing in the doorway. Captain Williams was already dressed for his flight, looking every bit the part of a pilot with his golden stripes and crisp uniform. Marcus beamed with pride. His dad looked like a hero, straight out of the aviation magazines they often read together, almost ready for takeoff, co-pilot. Captain Williams asked, his voice carrying both warmth and authority. Marcus stood at attention, mimicking his dad's stance. "Yes, sir, just packing my lucky plane." Captain Williams crossed the room and knelt down beside him, adjusting the small wings pinned on Marcus's jacket. "This is a big day, buddy, your first solo flight," he said softly, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. "I'm proud of you." Marcus felt his chest swell with pride. "Thanks, Dad. I won't let you down." Captain Williams placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his tone turning serious. "Remember, no matter what happens, you keep your head up, all right? You're a part of this team just like me." "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, his voice steady with one last look around his room. Marcus picked up his backpack and followed his father out to the car. The drive to the airport was filled with excitement, with Marcus peppering his dad with questions about flying. "Dad, what's it like up there in the clouds?" he asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Captain Williams chuckled. "It's like the world is at your feet. The ground looks small, and you realize just how big the sky is. You're going to love it, son." As they approached the airport, Marcus's excitement grew. The terminals, the lines of planes parked outside, it was all part of the world he loved. He felt a thrill as they walked inside the airport's bustling atmosphere, filling him with a sense of adventure. Captain Williams led Marcus through the crowded terminal, his hand resting on his son's shoulder protectively. People nodded respectfully as they passed by, recognizing the captain's uniform and acknowledging his presence. Marcus stood a little taller. Feeling proud to be by his father's side at the security checkpoint, Captain Williams knelt down. "To Marcus's level one last time. This is where I say goodbye for now," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You remember everything we talked about?" Marcus nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. I'll stay in my seat. Follow the flight attendant's instructions and keep my seatbelt on." Captain Williams smiled, pride evident in his eyes. "Exactly. And remember, you're not alone on this flight. You're part of a team just like me. If you need help, don't hesitate to ask." With a final hug, Captain Williams handed Marcus his boarding pass. "I'll see you on the other side, son." Marcus watched as his father disappeared down a separate hallway, his figure tall and confident. Taking a deep breath, he turned and walked toward the gate, his heart racing with a mixture of excitement and nerves. As Marcus reached the gate, he approached the check-in counter, standing on his tiptoes to hand over his boarding pass. Claire Mitchell, the senior flight attendant on duty, barely glanced up as she took his pass. her expression neutral and indifferent. Unaccompanied minor, her tone was brisk as though he were just another task to complete. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied politely. "I'm going to see my aunt. My dad made sure everything was ready." Claire glanced at him briefly before returning to her computer. Her fingers moving briskly across the keyboard without looking up, she muttered, "Stand still, please," and handed him a small tag to attach to his backpack. Marcus felt a pang of unease as he watched her move with a cold efficiency, her eyes never meeting his. Swallowing, he gathered his courage and spoke up. "My dad is the pilot on this flight," he said, hoping the mention of his father might spark a bit of kindness. Claire's gaze flicked up briefly, her eyes narrowing with skepticism. "Look, young man, we don't do special treatment here. No need to make up stories." The words stung, and Marcus's cheeks flushed. He wanted to explain further, but something in her tone told him it wouldn't matter. Silently, he took his tag, fastened it to his backpack, and waited as she processed the rest of his check-in. When the boarding call came, Marcus joined the line, clutching his backpack as he made his way toward the plane. Excitement still simmered beneath his nerves, and he reminded himself of his father's advice. "Keep your head up," stepping into the cabin. He looked around hoping for a warm greeting, but CLA was already ahead of him, ushering him toward his assigned seat with a quick, impersonal gesture as he walked down the aisle. Marcus's eyes sparkled with curiosity, taking in every detail of the plane's interior, the seats, the overhead bins, the small windows. It was all part of the world he loved so much. He reached his assigned seat by the window, carefully putting his backpack beneath the seat in front of him, settling in. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling a bit more at ease his father had chosen this seat, specifically because he knew how much Marcus loved watching the wings during takeoff. He looked out the window, his mind already imagining the view from the sky, but as he fastened his seatbelt, he noticed CLA approaching again. Her expression was firm, and her eyes scanned his. "His seat number, unaccompanied minors, sit in the back," she stated flatly, gesturing to a seat near the lavatory. "It's airline policy." Marcus's heart sank. He had been so excited to sit by the window just like his dad had arranged, but he didn't want to cause any trouble. So he simply nodded and gathered his things, following her to the back of the plane. The new seat was cramped, wedged against the bathroom wall with only a partial view out the tiny window. The constant sound of the lavatory door opening and closing filled the space, and Marcus felt his excitement dim. He hugged his backpack a little closer, feeling a wave of loneliness wash over him. He tried to stay positive, reminding himself of his father's words. He was still on the plane, still part of the team. But as he sat there listening to the hum of passengers settling in, he couldn't shake the feeling that some had changed a few rows. Up an elderly man with silver hair caught sight of Marcus watching, as the young boy sat quietly by himself. The man's eyes softened, and he leaned over, offering a kind smile. "Quite the little traveler. Aren't you?" he said, his voice warm and friendly. Marcus looked up, managing a small smile. "Yes, sir, my dad is the pilot on this flight." The elderly man nodded, his smile growing. "Well, you must be very proud. Not everyone gets to fly with family." Marcus felt his spirits lift a little. Maybe he thought this flight would turn out better than he expected as the plane finished boarding. Marcus tried to get comfortable in his cramped seat at the back, tucked right against the lavatory door. His view out, the tiny window was mostly obstructed by the plane's wind, and the constant opening and closing of the lavatory door filled his ears with loud clicks and muffled chatter from the passengers walking by. It wasn't what he'd pictured sitting on this special flight with his father as the pilot, but he reminded himself of his dad's advice: keep your head up no matter what. His small hand brushed over the junior pilot wings pinned to his jacket, a quiet reassurance in the unfamiliar setting. Nearby, a flight attendant was making her way down the aisle, handing out snacks and drinks. Marcus recognized her as Claire, the same woman who had dismissed him at the gate and told him to move seats. He watched her as she served each row, her expression shifting into a polite smile for each passenger. When she reached his row, however, her expression turned stony again. "Would you like a drink?" she asked, her tone brisk and impersonal. "Yes, please. May I have apple juice?" Marcus replied politely, hoping maybe this time she'd be friendly. Her Claire poured a cup of apple juice, but instead of handing it to him carefully, like she had with the other passengers, she placed it down on his tray with a bit of a thud, causing some of the juice to splash up the sides. Marcus's smile faded slightly as he thanked her, trying not to let her cold attitude affect him. Across Ross, the aisle, an elderly woman noticed the interaction, her eyebrows knitting together. She looked from Marcus to CLA, her face reflecting a growing sense of disapproval. CLA, however, moved on without noticing the woman's expression as he sipped his juice. Marcus took out his sketchbook and pencils from his backpack. Drawing airplanes was one of his favorite hobbies, and he thought sketching the wing of the plane he could just barely see out his window might help pass the time. He carefully positioned his sketchbook on the tray and started outlining the sleek lines of the aircraft wing lost. In his concentration, a few minutes later, Claire was walking back down the aisle, her eyes scanning the rows when she saw Marcus's sketchbook open with pencils laid out neatly beside it. She stopped abruptly. Her expression hardened as she glanced at the young boy, then at the small pencils and eraser on his tray. "This isn't art class, young man," she said sharply. "Make sure you don't get pencil marks or shavings all over the seat. We have enough work without cleaning up after careless passengers." Marcus's face flushed with embarrassment, and his fingers trembled slightly as he began, gathering his pencils and closing his sketchbook. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper nearby. Passengers, including the elderly woman and a businessman sitting a few rows up, watched the exchange in quiet surprise. They exchanged glances, noting the unnecessarily harsh tone CLA had used with Marcus. Some shook their heads slightly, their expression showing a mixture of sympathy and disapproval. Marcus put his sketchbook back in his backpack. His excitement for the flight now dimmed even further. He hadn't meant to cause any trouble. He'd only wanted to pass the time in a way that reminded him of his dad and the many times they'd sat together sketching planes. As he adjusted his backpack, he absently touched the junior pilot wings pinned to his jacket, hoping they'd bring him some comfort. A few rows ahead, a young mother with a toddler on her lap whispered to her husband, glancing back at Marcus. "Did you see how she spoke to that little boy?" she murmured, concern etched in her face. Her husband nodded. "Yeah, she seems to be singling him out. Poor kid's just sitting there quietly." The plane reached cruising altitude, and the flight attendants moved about the cabin, serving drinks and adjusting passenger requests as they bustled up and down the aisle. Marcus stayed in his seat, looking out the small window and clutching his backpack. Close, the sense of isolation felt almost tangible now. Like an invisible barrier separating him from the other passengers, he missed the comforting presence of his father, knowing that he was somewhere far ahead in the cockpit, unaware of the challenges his son was facing in the back of the plane. He tried to distract himself by studying the seatback pocket in front of him, where he found a small set of Inlight activity sheets. Marcus pulled them out, hoping a little coloring or puzzle solving would lift his spirits. He was carefully tracing a cartoon airplane on one of the sheets when he felt a tap on his shoulder. He looked up to see CLA standing over him once again. "You shouldn't be using that pen on the activity sheets. Crayons are less messy," she said. Her voice edged with irritation. "If you get pen on the seat, it's very difficult to remove." Marcus lowered his gaze, setting the pen aside. "Yes, ma'am," he murmured, feeling smaller and more isolated with every word. Once CLA left, an elderly man seated in the aisle next to him, leaned over. His face was kind. His eyes filled with understanding. "You doing all right there, young man?" he asked softly, offering Marcus a gentle smile. Marcus looked up and nodded, but the sadness in his eyes must have been clear because the man placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Name's Harold, but my friends call me Mr. Lewis," he said warmly. "You remind me of my grandson. He loves planes too." The mention of planes sparked a bit of life in Marcus's eyes. "My dad's the pilot on this plane," he replied, his voice filled with quiet. pride. One day, I wanted to be a pilot too, just like him. Mr. Lewis's face softened. Well, now that's something special. You're on the right track with those wings. I'd say he nodded to the junior pilot wings pinned to Marcus's jacket. You know, sometimes people don't see us for who we really are, but that doesn't change who we are inside. You keep those wings close, young man. They mean something. Marcus felt his spirits lift a little as he listened to Mr. Lewis's words. He felt understood, even if just by one person, and that small connection helped ease the loneliness that had been creeping in. The hum of the engines was soothing, and Marcus began to relax a bit, turning his focus back to the window. Just then, CLA came down the aisle again, this time stopping 2 rows ahead of him, where an elderly woman was struggling to fasten her seat back out. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice a little shaky. "My hands aren't as steady as they used to be. Could you help me with this?" CLA looked at her with a hint of impatience. "I'm in the middle of my rounds," she replied briskly. "I'll check back in a moment." As Claire walked off, Marcus's eyes stayed on the woman. He watched her struggle with the seatbelt, her arthritic fingers unable to grip the latch properly without thinking. Marcus unbuckled his own seatbelt and leaned across the aisle. "May I help you with that, ma'am?" he asked politely, his voice gentle. The elderly woman looked up at him, her face relaxing into a grateful smile. "Oh, thank you, dear. That's very kind of you." Marcus carefully fastened the seatbelt for her, making sure it was secure, and gave her a small nod before returning. Turning to his seat, he barely had time to buckle himself in before he heard Clay's sharp voice behind him. "What do you think you're doing out of your seat?" Claire's tone was icy, her expression disapproving as she looked down at Marcus. Marcus looked up, his cheeks flushing. "I was just helping her with her seatbelt," he explained, his voice small. Claire folded her arms, her face hardening. "That's not your job. You need to stay seated. We have rules for a reason," she said curtly, loud enough that a few nearby passengers turned their heads in surprise. "But I was just no excuses," she interrupted, gesturing for him to sit back down. "You're creating unnecessary risks. Get back to your seat and stay there." Marcus lowered his head, slipping back into his seat. Without another word, the elderly woman, now securely buckled, glanced back at him, her face filled with sympathy. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but CLA had already moved on her expression, closed off and unreadable as Claire moved away. Murmurs began to spread through the rows, passengers who had witnessed. The exchange whispered to each other, their expressions reflecting a mix of shock and disapproval. The young mother from earlier leaned over to her husband again, her voice low but indignant. That poor boy he was just helping. That lady with her seatbelt, and she spoke to him like he was doing something wrong. The businessman across the aisle nodded in agreement, his brow furrowed. Seems like she's got something against him. He's done nothing but sit quietly the entire flight. The elderly woman Marcus had helped turn to the passenger next to her, sharing her own outrage. "That boy showed more kindness than that flight attendant has all day," she whispered. "If I could, I'd tell her a thing or two about how to treat people." Marcus, meanwhile, sat quietly in his seat, clutching his backpack with a mixture of embarrassment and hurt. The excitement and pride he'd felt at the start of the journey seemed so distant now. All he wanted was to be like his father, to show the same grace and kindness his dad always showed others. But here, far from the cockpit, he felt invisible, or worse, seen only through a lens of dismissal. A quiet voice broke through his thoughts. "Don't worry, young man," Mr. Lewis said softly, giving him a reassuring smile. "Not everyone sees the world the way she does. You keep being yourself. The right people will notice," as the flight continued. Whispers of concern and disapproval began to ripple quietly through the cabin. Passengers who had noticed Claire's treatment of Marcus shared sympathetic glances and soft conversations. The young mother with the toddler spoke again to her husband, casting a glance back at Marcus. "He's just a child," she murmured, "and he's sitting there trying to help others while she scolds him like he's done something wrong." Her husband nodded in agreement, his brow furrowed. Seems like she's singling him out. There's no need for that kind of attitude nearby. The elderly woman who Marcus had helped with her seatbelt continued to shake her head, her lips pressed into a firm line. You know, she whispered to the passenger beside her, that little boy showed me more kindness in 2 minutes than I've seen from that flight attendant all day. It's shameful treating him like that wordlessly. The passengers around her nodded their expressions, a mirror of her own dismay. Some glanced at Claire as she moved down the aisle, watching with new awareness as she attended to others with a carefully rehearsed smile and polite words. But that smile seemed to disappear whenever she came near Marcus's row, replaced by a cold, indifferent expression that made it clear she wasn't interested in engaging with him as CLA passed by Marcus again. Mr. Lewis, the elderly man seated nearby, gave her a polite nod, hoping to perhaps soften her demeanor, but Claire returned only a curt nod, her expression steely as she moved on without a word. Mr. Lewis turned to Marcus with a gentle smile. "You're handling this all very well, young man," he said kindly. "Just remember, it's not about you. Some people carry around things that make them see the world in ways that aren't always." Fair Marcus listened, his eyes reflecting both confusion and a growing understanding. He nodded slowly, taking a deep breath as he let Mr. Lewis's words sink in. The plane settled into its cruising altitude and passengers began to relax, some taking out books or tablets. While others closed their eyes for a short nap, Marcus, however, remained wide awake, his gaze shifting between the small view out his window and his backpack on his lap. The small model airplane he'd brought with him, a miniature version of the very plane he was on, was carefully tucked inside. He debated taking it out, thinking it might bring him some comfort, but hesitated, worried he might inadvertently cause more trouble. Noticing his hesitation, Mr. Lewis leaned over with a gentle smile. "You've got something special in there, don't you?" he asked, nodding toward the backpack. Marcus glanced up, a shy smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's my favorite model plane," he said softly. "Just like the one we're flying in. My dad gave it to me." He paused, his fingers tracing the outline of the plane through the backpack's fabric. "He's actually flying. This plane, he's the captain." Mr. Lewis's eyes brightened with interest. "Well, now that's something remarkable you're flying with family." Then Marcus nodded, his smile widening a bit. "Yes, sir. One day I want to be a pilot too, just like my dad." The older man's expression softened, a twinkle in his eye. "Sounds like a fine dream. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, all right?" He gave Marcus a reassuring nod. "And don't ever forget those wings you're wearing. They mean something from a few rows up." Another passenger, a businessman who had been quietly observing the interactions, leaned over to catch Mr. Lewis's attention. "Did I hear correctly?" he asked, his voice lowered but filled with interest. "Is that boy the son of the pilot?" Mr. Lewis nodded, a hint of pride in his tone. "Yes, he is, and he's been polite as can be. You'd think he'd be treated a bit better given how much respect he's shown." The businessman's expression darkened slightly. "Well, it's clear she doesn't know who he is. That's no way to treat anyone, let alone a child." The murmurs continued spreading, slowly but steadily, as more passengers began to take notice quietly. They exchanged knowing glances and subtle nods, forming a silent but powerful circle of support around Marcus. Some felt a sense of protective indignation, while others, remembering times they'd seen such behavior themselves, felt compelled to ensure this young boy wasn't left to endure it alone. At one point, Sarah Thompson, the co-pilot, made her way through the cabin. She enjoyed taking a quick stroll during long flights, using the time to connect with passengers and make sure everyone felt at ease when she reached Marcus's row. She paused, noting the boys' junior pilot wings and the small model plane he'd just taken out of his backpack. "Hey there, young man," she said warmly, kneeling beside him to get on his level. "Those are some pretty impressive wings you're wearing." Marcus looked up, his face lighting up with excitement. "Thank you, ma'am. My dad gave them to me. He's the pilot on this plane." Sarah's eyes sparkled with recognition, and she nodded approvingly. "Well, that's something special, isn't it? You know it's not every day. A future pilot gets to ride in the cabin with his dad at the controls." Marcus beamed, and for a brief moment, he felt the joy he'd been missing since the start of the flight one day. "I want to be just like him," he said. His voice filled with pride. Sarah's smile grew a touch of admiration in her gaze. "With the heart you've got, I'd say you're well on your way." She gave him a gentle pat on the shoulder, her kindness standing in stark contrast to the cold demeanor he'd received from CLA. Just then Claire's voice cut through the moment from further up the aisle. "Sarah, we need you in the cockpit." Sarah gave Marcus a reassuring wink before standing up, but not before catching the look of irritation on Claire's face. Her own expression softened as she looked back at the young boy you hang in there, co-pilot. "And remember, you're not alone." As Sarah walked back toward the front of the plane, Claire watched her with an unreadable expression. She turned to see Marcus's model plane sitting proudly on his tray, a small reminder of his dream and his connection to his father. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, a brief shadow of something unspoken, though it quickly vanished as she turned back to her duties, resuming her brisk, non-nonsense pace over time. The passengers around Marcus grew increasingly frustrated with Claire's behavior. The young mother with the toddler, the businessman, and Mr. Lewis each shared a look of silent agreement. Realizing that they couldn't just sit back and watch without saying anything, the elderly woman who Marcus had helped with her seatbelt quietly voiced her thoughts to the passenger beside her. "Something should be done about this," she murmured, her voice laced with determination. "That boy deserves better. We all deserve better." The businessman, overhearing her, nodded firmly. "I'm with you. I don't think anyone should have to put up with this kind of treatment, especially not a child." As the plane continued its steady journey through the clouds, the group of passengers began to form a quiet but resolute alliance. Whispers turned into shared nods and quiet conversations, and soon they had a plan. Upon landing, they would bring their observations forward, filing a formal complaint if necessary. They would stand together, ensuring that the boy who had shown nothing but respect and kindness was heard in his seat, unaware of the growing solidarity around him. Marcus continued to look out the small window, his thoughts far away. He clutched his model plane and took a deep breath, replaying his father's words in his mind. "Keep your head up, son. You're part of this team." Those words resonated with him, reminding him that even in a small seat by the lavatory, he still belonged. He was still the son of Captain Williams, the boy who dreamed of the sky. Mr. Lewis leaned over once more, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "You're doing just fine, Marcus. Just keep being who you are, the right. Ooh, people see you." Marcus looked up, gratitude shining in his eyes as he nodded. For the first time since boarding the plane, he felt a sense of strength, knowing he wasn't as alone as he had thought. As the group continued their quiet discussions, Sarah passed by once again, this time with a subtle nod of encouragement to Mr. Lewis and the businessman who had both been watching over Marcus. Her look was one of understanding and quiet resolve, as if silently assuring them that she too had noticed the treatment Marcus had endured. With a quick but meaningful glance, Sarah signaled that she would be keeping an eye on things, ready to support their efforts if needed. The passengers shared a look of mutual understanding, their silent resolve solidifying. When the time came, they would speak up not just for Marcus, but for anyone who had ever faced unfairness or prejudice. Together they would ensure that kindness and respect were upheld even at 35. 00 FT in the air, and in his small seat by the lavatory, Marcus took another deep breath, his fingers tracing the junior pilot wings on his jacket, feeling the quiet but steadfast support surrounding him as the flight continued. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the start of the meal service. Passengers relaxed, some flipping through in-flight magazines or watching movies on their devices. Marcus, still sitting by the lavatory, opened his backpack to retrieve his small sketchbook. He began sketching quietly his pencil. Capturing the sleek lines of the airplane wing he could just barely see from his small, obstructed window. A few rows up, the group of passengers who had been observing Clay's treatment of Marcus exchanged knowing glances. Their disapproval quietly mounting, each had noticed the pattern how CLA would smile and offer assistance to nearly everyone else, yet seemed to dismiss Marcus at every turn. Finally, the young mother with the toddler who had been silently watching spoke up. To her husband, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "This is enough. I'm going to say something to her if she keeps this up." Her husband nodded in agreement, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You're right. The boy's done nothing wrong, and she's treating him like he's a burden." At that moment, CLA emerged from the galley, pushing the meal cart down the aisle. She stopped at each row, her demeanor polite, her voice friendly as she offered drinks and snacks to each passenger. But when she reached Marcus's row, her expression shifted. Her tone turned flat as she addressed him. "Would you like a drink?" she asked, barely glancing his way. "Yes, please, may I have an apple juice?" Marcus replied politely, hoping that maybe she'd be kinder this time without a word. CLA poured the juice and placed it down with a thud on his tray, some of the liquid splashing over the sides. Marcus thanked her softly, doing his best to stay positive, though his shoulders drooped slightly as CLA continued down the aisle. Mr. Lewis, the elder gentleman who had befriended Marcus, couldn't hold back any longer, clearing his throat. He raised his hand to get her attention. "Excuse me, Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'd like to speak to you about something if you don't mind." Claire stopped, turning to him with a slightly impatient expression. "Yes. Can I help you with something?" Mr. Lewis's eyes were steady, filled with a quiet determination. "I couldn't help but notice how you've been speaking to that young boy over there." He nodded toward Marcus, who was looking down at his juice, trying to avoid drawing attention. Claire's expression tightened. "I'm simply doing my job, sir. All passengers must follow the same rules." Mr. Lewis tilted his head slightly, a small frown forming on his face. "Of course, but it seems to me you've been going out of your way to enforce rules that don't quite apply. The young man's been nothing but polite around them." Other passengers began to pay closer attention, some nodding in agreement. The young mother leaned forward, adding softly, "He's just a child, and he's done everything he's been asked. There's no need to treat him differently." CLA glanced around, realizing that more and more passengers were watching the exchange. Her posture stiffened, and she replied, "I'm following standard procedures for unaccompanied minors. The airline has policies, and it's my responsibility to make sure they're followed." The businessman from a few rows up spoke up, his tone laced with quiet disapproval. "I fly regularly, and I can't say I've seen a child treated quite this way. And I couldn't help but notice that he mentioned his father is the pilot of this plane." At this, KLA's eyes narrowed, though she quickly masked it. She shifted uncomfortably, clearly, taken aback by the growing solidarity among the passengers regardless of who his father is. Claire replied, her voice clipped, "I'm responsible for ensuring order and compliance on this flight," but her words didn't seem to hold the same authority they once had. The passengers exchanged glances, their faces reflecting the same quiet resolve to stand up for the young boy who had shown nothing but respect. Just then, Sarah Thompson, the co-pilot, made her way down the aisle, alerted by the unusual tension she sensed in the cabin. She approached the group, her gaze settling on Claire with a quiet but firm expression. "Everything all right here?" Sarah asked, her tone steady. CLA straightened clearly, feeling the scrutiny, just following standard protocol. She replied quickly, "Some passengers seem to have concerns about our policies." Sarah's eyes moved to Mr. Lewis, then to Marcus, who was sitting quietly looking down at his hands, clearly aware of the growing attention around him. With a soft smile, Sarah knelt down beside Marcus. "Hey there, co-pilot," she said gently. "How's the flight going so far?" Marcus looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of relief and surprise at her kindness. It's okay, ma'am," he replied, his voice steady but small. Sarah nodded, a spark of encouragement in her eyes. "I hear you're quite the aviation enthusiast. Is that a model of this plane you've got there?" Marcus nodded, holding up his small model plane with pride. "Yes, ma'am. My dad gave it to me." "Well, that's pretty special," Sarah said with a grin. "Not everyone gets to bring a little piece of the skies along with them." She gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder before standing, her gaze shifting back to Claire with a soft but serious tone. Sarah addressed her fellow flight attendant, CLA. "Could we have a quick word in the galley?" "CLA." Claire hesitated, glancing at the watching passengers. "I have duties to attend to. I'm sure the passengers will understand." Sarah replied, her tone leaving no room for argument, with an uncomfortable nod. CLA followed Sarah to the rear galley, the weight of the passenger stairs following her once they were out of earshot. Sarah crossed her arms, her expression a mixture of disappointment and concern. "Claire, what's going on? I've seen you work these flights countless times, and I've never seen you act like this." Claire looked away, her expression defensive. "I'm simply enforcing policy, unaccompanied minors need structure, and I was ensuring he followed the rules." Sarah's gaze softened, though her voice remained firm. "There's structure, and then there's crossing a line. That boy is just trying to enjoy his flight. You know, his father's one of the best pilots we have. Marcus looks up to him. He's following in his footsteps." She paused, her eyes searching Kaylee's face. "Why are you so hard on him?" Kaylee's face hardened, but beneath the surface something flickered. She lowered her gaze, her voice barely audible. "It's just sometimes these kids think they can do whatever they want, like they're above the rules." Sarah shook her head slowly. "This isn't about the rules, Claire. This is about how you're choosing to treat someone who's done nothing wrong. You know as well as I do that being kind doesn't cost a thing." Claire's shoulders slumped slightly, her usual authoritative posture softening the words from her. Colleague, combined with the disapproving stares from the passengers, were beginning to chip away at the wall she'd built around herself. I didn't mean to be harsh," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just been a difficult month, so much going on, and it's easy to forget who we're here for." Sarah placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, her tone softening. "I get it. Claire, we all have hard days. But that boy is part of this team, just like you and me. He's just trying to enjoy his flight and show respect for what is. Father does, he deserves the same respect from us." In return, for a moment, Claire stood there in silence, her gaze distant. She thought back to her early days as a flight attendant, when she had been filled with excitement and pride, when every passenger felt like a new connection. Over the years, that initial spark had dimmed and the pressures of the job had hardened her. A knot of regret began to form in her chest as she realized just how much her attitude had shifted the passengers' reactions. Mr. Lewis's words, and now Sarah's gentle reminder, were a wake-up call. She glanced back down the aisle where Marcus sat quietly, his small frame dwarfed by the large seat, yet holding himself with quiet dignity, taking a deep breath. Claire looked back at Sarah, her voice filled with genuine remorse. "I think I may have some apologizing to do." Sarah nodded, a small smile of encouragement on her face. "It's never too late to make things right with hesitant steps." Claire made her way back down the aisle toward Marcus's seat. The passengers watched her closely, their expressions a mixture of expectation and curiosity. She stopped beside Marcus's row, her gaze softening as she looked down at the young boy who had endured so much with such quiet strength. "Marcus," she began, her voice unsteady, "I owe you an apology. I didn't treat you with the respect you deserve, and I'm truly sorry." Marcus looked up, surprised. Flickering in his eyes, he hesitated, then nodded, his voice soft. "Thank you, ma'am," around them the passengers who had witnessed the previous interactions exchanged. Approving nods, a quiet sense of resolution filling the cabin. Mr. Lewis gave Marcus a small nod of encouragement, and Sarah watched from a distance, satisfaction in her gaze. In that moment, the tension in the cabin eased, replaced by a sense of unity and shared understanding. Marcus's journey had taken an unexpected turn, but he had navigated it with a strength. Beyond his years, reminding everyone on board of the power of kindness, resilience, and the courage to make things right. The gentle chime, signaling the beginning of descent, echoed through the cabin, and passengers began preparing for landing. Marcus, seated by the laboratory with his model airplane and sketchbook safely tucked into his backpack, glanced out the window, his heart racing as he imagined reuniting with his father after the challenging flight beside him. Mr. Lewis gave a reassuring pat on his shoulder. "Almost there, young man. Soon you'll be able to tell your dad all about your journey." Marcus nodded, a small smile forming on his face. The supportive presence of Mr. Lewis, Sarah, and the other passengers had helped him through moments of loneliness and doubt. Now knowing he'd soon be back with his father gave him a renewed sense of peace. The final announcements began as Claire moved down the aisle, checking seatbelt and tray tables. With a noticeably softened demeanor, she stopped by Marcus's row, offering him a brief but genuine smile. "Thank you for your patience today, Marcus," she said quietly. "And for your kindness, I'll try to remember it." Marcus returned her smile, his eyes shining with understanding. "Thank you, ma'am," he replied, his tone filled with quiet maturity around them. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier interactions shared, approving looks, some nodding slightly. In acknowledgement of Claire's change in attitude, the businessman seated a few rows up turned to the elderly woman who had been assisted by Marcus earlier. "It's rare to see a young man handle himself so well. He's got his father's spirit." I'd say the elderly woman smiled, watching Marcus with warmth in her gaze. "Yes, indeed, this is one flight." I won't soon forget the wheels touched down smoothly, and as the plane taxied to the gate, Marcus felt his excitement grow. The terminal was just within reach, and with it the familiar embrace of his father as the plane came to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign clicked off passengers' rows. Gathering their belongings, some stretched, others chatted quietly, but many cast quick, supportive glances at Marcus as they prepared to depain. The businessman gave him a nod, and the young mother with her toddler smiled at him warmly, mouthing, "You did great, one by one." The passengers disembarked, some lingering just long enough to give Claw a friendly but knowing look as they passed. Sarah stood by the cockpit door, watching with a subtle but satisfied smile as her fellow passengers showed their silent solidarity with Mark. She nodded to Mr. Lewis, who gave her a tip of his hat in gratitude for her support. Finally, Marcus stood up, his backpack secured on his shoulders and his model plane safely stowed inside. He walked down the aisle with a mixture of pride and relief, feeling the weight of the journey settle into something he would carry with him forever. As he stepped out into the terminal, his eyes scanned the crowd eagerly, and then there he was, Captain Jordan Williams, standing tall in his crisp uniform, his face lighting up the moment he spotted Marcus. "There's my boy," Captain Williams called out, kneeling to Marcus's level and opening his arms wide. Marcus broke into a grin and ran into his father's embrace. Feeling the familiar warmth and strength in his father's hold, he buried his face in the uniform that had come to symbolize everything he admired: kindness, strength, and respect. Captain Williams pulled back slightly, his eyes searching his son's face. "How was the flight, buddy?" he asked, gently sensing there was more to the story. Marcus hesitated, glancing back toward the gate where he had just come from. The memories of Claire's dismissive treatment and the passengers who had stood by him were still fresh, but so were the moments of kindness, the quiet support he'd received from people like Mr. Lewis and Sarah. He looked back up at his father, his expression thoughtful. It was different. Marcus replied, honestly, a hint of pride in his tone. "But I made some friends, and I think I learned a lot." Captain Williams smiled, understanding immediately. "Well, sounds like you handled it just fine." He straightened up, resting a proud hand on Marcus's shoulder. You know, I've got a little time before my next flight. How about I introduce you to a few people in the cockpit? Marcus's eyes widened with excitement, any remaining fatigue. Vanishing instantly, really. Captain Williams chuckled, giving him a small nod. Really, let's go see the heart of this plane together. The hum of the engines had faded, and the cockpit was a quiet sanctuary. Captain Williams guided Marcus to the co-pilot's seat, helping him settle in. Marcus looked around, wide-eyed, taking in the array of switches, dials, and screens that seemed to fill every available space. These are your primary flight controls. Captain Williams explained, his tone patient and filled with pride. They keep us balanced in the sky. And over here, this one tells us how high we're flying. Marcus reached out, not touching anything, but tracing the controls in the air, as if imprinting them on his memory. He looked over at his father with awe. Dad, this is incredible. It's like the whole world is right here. Captain Williams nodded. That's right. But being a pilot isn't just about flying the plane, Marcus. It's about taking care of everyone on board, making sure they feel safe, respected, and valued. He paused, looking down at his son. Sometimes that means standing up for yourself, and sometimes it means standing up for others. Marcus nodded, his gaze thoughtful as he looked out at the vast expanse of sky stretching beyond the cockpit windows. Like how Mr. Lewis and everyone else on the plane stood up for me. Captain Williams's smile was warm, filled with pride. Exactly. You see, being part of a team, whether in the cockpit or in the cabin, means we're all there for each other, no matter what. He reached out, placing a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, and you, my son, showed that you're ready for that responsibility. You handled yourself with respect and courage. That's something not everyone can do for a moment. Father and son sat together in quiet appreciation, sharing the wonder of the cockpit and the lesson it had come to represent, the wide horizon stretched out before them, a reminder of the endless possibilities that lay ahead. As they left the cockpit, they passed through the terminal where Mr. Lewis and a few other passengers had lingered to say goodbye, seeing Marcus. Mr. Lewis stepped forward, his face lighting up. Well, if it isn't my young pilot friend, he greeted warmly. How was the tour? Marcus grinned, looking up at his father, then back at Mr. Lewis. It was amazing. My dad showed me everything. Mr. Lewis chuckled, patting Marcus on the shoulder. You're well on your way, young man. Keep those dreams close, all right? The elderly woman whom Marcus had helped during the flight also approached, giving him a grateful smile. Thank you again for your kindness, dear. It meant the world to me. Marcus smiled shyly, nodding. It was my pleasure, ma'am. As they spoke, Claire emerged from the gate, her expression subdued. She approached Marcus and Captain Williams, her face reflecting a mixture of regret and humility. She took a deep breath, her gaze meeting Captain Williams before shifting to Marcus. Captain Williams. Marcus, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for the way I behaved on the flight. She began, her voice wavering slightly. Sometimes we forget the impact our actions can have. I didn't treat you fairly, and I'm truly sorry. Captain Williams looked down at Marcus, then back at CLA, giving her a small nod. Thank you for your apology, CLA. It takes courage to admit when we've been wrong. Marcus nodded, offering her a small smile. Thank you, ma'am, he said softly. I understand and I forgive you. Claire's face softened, a hint of gratitude in her expression, as she nodded, clearly. Moved, thank you, Marcus. That means a lot. As Marcus and his father walked toward the exit, he couldn't help but look back one last time. The terminal, filled with strangers who had shown him kindness and solidarity, now felt like a place of connection rather than just a passageway. This experience, he realized, was one he would carry with him. Always. Dad, Marcus said, looking up as they walked, do you think one day I'll be a pilot too? Captain Williams smiled, his gaze filled with unwavering belief. I know you will, Marcus. You've already shown you've got what it takes. They stepped outside into the bright sunlight, the vast blue sky stretching endlessly above them. For Marcus, it was more than just a clear day. It was a reminder of the dreams that lay ahead, waiting for him to chase them. just as he always dreamed with that Marcus's journey. One that started with challenges and ended with courage, came to a close. A story of resilience, kindness, and the power of standing together when it matters most. If you were inspired by Marcus's journey and the kindness he found along the way, hit that like button to show your support. Let us know in the comments what's one act of kindness you've experienced that made a difference in your life. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of the power of courage, resilience, and the strength of community. See you in the next one.